All right, welcome back to the Cyber Canvas. My name is Nick Morpus and I am a cybersecurity professional. And today I want to talk about zero trust washing, namely where zero trust, the term itself, is being abused, what real zero trust is, and where marketing is actually meeting with reality, and the potential consequences that this is creating where companies are using the term incorrectly. So let's dive into it. So before we really get into it, let's establish some ground rules. So what is zero trust? First off, it is not an appliance. It is not a software solution, and it is not a VPN. I know a lot of companies like to market out and say, oh, they're selling zero trust, and they will have a box, or they will have a VPN, or some software solution. No. What zero trust is, according to the company that even coined the term, Forrester, zero trust is essentially the principle of never trust, always verify. It's an idea, it's a security concept that a lot of different tools can be built around with this idea in mind, but there's no just one tool that is zero trust. It is just a principle of security that is applied across networks, data security, identity, all kinds of things. It is an idea. So like any idea, there are certain, I guess, guidelines and principles that make up an idea that essentially set the boundaries of what that idea is. And there are four distinct principles of zero trust. The first of them being that there is no implicit trust. And what this means is that no matter who we're talking about, whether we're talking about users, devices, applications, AI models, it doesn't matter. No matter what it is, if you want access to specific data or a specific network or anything that has to do or that is protected within a zero trust framework, there is no implicit trust given to anything or anyone. The second is assuming a breach has already occurred. And what this means is it's a very proactive approach of security, assuming that the threats have already made their way through, and it doesn't really matter how much, how good your security is. Everything is always locked down, and there is always an implicit, lack of trust in anything that has access to your data or networks, or could have potential access to your data or networks. The third is least privileged access. And this is something I kind of touched on in the last episode. And the idea around least privileged access is that you grant access to users, devices, applications, and no matter what it is, you only grant them exactly what it is that they need for the most limited amount of time that they need to complete a specific task, and only that data or that function or that resource is only granted to them to the absolute extent needed in order to complete a task. And then finally, there is continuous verification. And what this means is that even though you are granted initial access to something, you're going to be expected, a user, device, application, network, a network appliance, doesn't matter what it is, will have to continuously verify that it does have actual access to this data. You have to verify an identity, the location of wherever this user, device, application is originating from. You will have to continuously verify the security posture of that user or device, what have you. this continuous verification allows for regular checks to make sure that, although this person was trusted on this one instance in which they were granted access to this data or resource, doesn't mean we're going to trust them the next time, because it could be a threat actor posing as someone who is legitimate, someone who is trusted before. So this continuous verification allows to maintain continuous security and protection to the specific resources that someone is trying to access at any given point in time. So what makes zero trust as a concept so powerful is that it essentially shifted the way we thought about security, going from your standard perimeter-based security to a data-based framework of security. And for those who aren't aware, a perimeter is the old ways in which we did things. You had your internal networks, your switches, your routers, your switches connected to all the different endpoints, the internal server that was connected to the router that could route traffic off into a DMZ to test for malware or any kind of delayed threat software. And all of this was protected by an outer layer of security, on the other side of the router. This would be like your firewall. And this would essentially try to do packet filtering to check for, malicious attempts to access the network. And then once you left the network, over time, we started adopting VPNs, which would essentially encrypt traffic that left the network out into the internet and route it to wherever it needed to go and try to deflect attacks off of the encrypted traffic, whether that was to the generalized internet, to websites, or the cloud. And this worked, but the problem is that this didn't account for attackers using legitimate means, legitimate resources to get in. Essentially, think of somebody sneaking into a building wearing a disguise as a janitor. They look like a legitimate person that should be in the building, but in reality, they are a threat actor looking to steal your stuff. So this was the inherent flaw of perimeter-based security. It didn't account for things like identity. It didn't protect from internal threats that would look to exfiltrate data. And because of that, we had to rethink the way we do security. And this is where zero trust comes in as a concept. It is a data-based approach where every bit of data itself is locked by default and secured by default, and only by meeting certain criteria in a checklist, whether that was, who are you? Why are you accessing this? Where are you accessing this from? What is the security posture of your device? You would have to go through multi-factor authentication. You have to, a lot of times, use a single sign-on. And then there will be additional security measures, such as deep packet inspection, that will inspect traffic to look for any kind of contextual threats that should be looked for. There are behavioral analysis tools out there that will evaluate specific behaviors and locations and times that things are being accessed. And all of this, you have to meet a certain list and set of criteria in order to have that data unlocked for you. This is a very rudimentary idea of how zero trust is implemented. It is data-based, not your typical, moat and castle, put up the walls kind of security that we relied on in decades past. So what does this mean with zero trust washing? Now, I said earlier that a VPN is not zero trust. Now, what I meant by that is that having a VPN alone is not zero trust. Just having a VPN does not mean you have zero trust. It is not just a specific tool. Now, in recent years, there have been tools that have been released that use the zero trust moniker. Say, ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Access. Now, ZTNA uses the zero trust framework in order to decide who gets access to the network, when they get access to it, how they get access to it, how long they can have access to it, when. All of these different things are taken into account using a zero trust framework to grant access to a network. And that is what zero trust network access is. There are other companies I do remember in my time working at Netscope. I don't know if they're still using the term. I'd have to look into it again. But they were using a term called ZTDP, and it was zero trust data protection. And the idea is that data protection at rest would live under a sort of zero trust framework in order to decide who is granted access to that specific data. Whether or not they actually carried that term forward in these past few years, I'm not 100% sure, but that was the idea and framework in which they were operating under. So to say that zero trust, or at least that VPNs are not zero trust, is kind of a shift itself in the conversation. A VPN can be part of a zero trust framework, but just having one alone is not zero trust in and of itself. To get access to the network, say that the traffic that a ZTNA is routing and is protected, encrypted as a tunnel, as tunnel traffic. In order for it to be considered zero trust, there would have to be zero trust principles attached to the access of that network at either end, or even, granting access to it in the middle. Zero trust as a framework is a bunch of principles that have to be applied. So in order to gain access to that tunneled traffic, you have to meet the criteria set forward in a zero trust framework in order to gain that access. So the VPN alone is not the same as having zero trust. In fact, just having a VPN alone and calling that zero trust, again, like the janitor example, it would be like, say, an intruder breaking into Fort Knox using an armored vehicle. Sure, no one else is going to be penetrating inside the vehicle, but what is inside the vehicle is someone who should not be there in the first place. So just to reiterate, a VPN is not zero trust. So I know what some people might be thinking, what's the big deal in us calling this zero trust or that zero trust? When we're talking about zero trust washing, the issue really comes into play when we're dealing with people who don't really understand exactly what zero trust is. They're sold on the idea, and then, they find out down the road they're not actually operating in a zero trust framework, and they are breached, and they scratch their heads and wonder why, oh why, how did someone get in? I thought I was protected. I was using zero trust. And I think really what it's doing is just diluting down the definition of what something is for marketing purposes. And trust me, I understand. I come from the product marketing space, and I understand the need sometimes to stretch terms for certain periods of time. However, if your framework is not able to deliver on those 4 principles we talked about earlier, then it can't by definition be called zero trust. It has to have that least privileged access. It has to assume that a breach has already occurred and treats all data and all participants like they are potentially part of a breach. All of these things are inherent to zero trust. And when we call things that aren't zero trust, it dilutes down the meaning to the point where people don't even pay attention to zero trust as a concept, which is actually a very solid concept, but they write it off as just marketing speak and saying that it doesn't really exist, or this or that company doesn't offer it, so I'm not going to really worry about it. It's all just a bunch of marketing fluff, when in reality, the principles themselves are not marketing fluff. It's unfortunate that there are certain companies that are just taking advantage of it, similar to the AI issue. But, what issue has not had, their have people just jump on to a term simply because it's popular and they need to get on that bandwagon lest they be left behind. So just to wrap this all up, If you are looking to adopt some sort of cybersecurity solution that is using zero trust in the name, I would recommend that you make sure that it abides by those four principles we talked about earlier. If you want to go with a solution that offers a ZTNA, that's fine. Just understand and make sure that it does abide by those four principles. And in that case, if all they have to offer is a ZTNA in terms of zero trust, they are not offering you a zero trust infrastructure or architecture. What they're offering you is a zero trust framework applied to network access only. It is not dealing with individualized data protection at rest. It is simply just access to the network. So when someone's offering or talking about zero trust, make sure to check if all of those features and functions and everything that they're offering comport with those four principles. And that way you can make a determination of whether or not you are actually getting the zero trust infrastructure you are being promised by a vendor. All right. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. I tried to keep it a little shorter than the last one. I understand it was kind of long. And as I kind of work my way through this, and with every episode, it's going to get cleaner, it's going to get more polished, and I will probably stop looking around so much. That's just the way I process. But, I know I got to look at you guys. And unfortunately, you have to look at me. So, yeah. Thank you for tuning in for this episode. Our next one will be probably released in the next week or so. It remains to be seen, but hopefully I'll see you on the next one. All right. Have a great day.